Secret treaties between rival knightly orders secretly reshaped the medieval world. We will uncover 24 of these forgotten alliances that changed the balance of power forever. You will discover how sworn enemies like the Templars and Hospitallers forged temporary pacts, setting aside bitter rivalries for survival and ambition. What led the fierce Teutonic Knights to absorb a rival order in the frozen north? How did a desperate financial deal between bankers in armor save an entire kingdom? This journey reveals the hidden diplomacy behind the Crusades, where a handshake could be more decisive than a cavalry charge. What does it truly mean when your greatest enemy becomes your only ally? These powerful brotherhoods existed in a world of constant tension. Picture a chessboard where each piece was a sovereign military order, answerable primarily to the Pope himself, yet fiercely independent. The Knights Templar, with their iconic white mantles and red cross, were founded to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. The Knights Hospitaller began with a mission of medical care, running hospitals for the sick, but they too evolved into a formidable military force. Their original purposes, though noble, inevitably began to clash. When two heavily armed groups, both claiming divine sanction, operate in the same small strip of sacred territory, conflict is inevitable. Their rivalry was not born of simple hatred, but of a fierce competition for the same resources. They vied for the favor of the Pope, for generous donations from European nobles, and for control over the same crucial castles and supply routes. This same pattern played out across the continent. In the harsh, frozen landscapes of the Baltic, the Teutonic Knights waged their own perpetual war, seeking to convert or conquer the local pagan tribes. Meanwhile, on the sun-baked plains of Spain and Portugal, orders like Calatrava and Santiago were on the front lines of the Reconquista, the centuries-long struggle to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula. Each of these orders was far more than a band of pious warriors. They were sprawling international corporations, amassing vast estates, operating early forms of banking, and commanding private armies that even kings sometimes feared. Their rivalries were as much about economics and politics as they were about faith or martial pride. In such a volatile landscape, where every other knightly order was a potential competitor, the idea of an alliance seemed unthinkable. Yet it was precisely this atmosphere of intense competition that made cooperation, however temporary, such a powerful and surprising weapon. This brings us to our first detailed story, a secret pact forged not in the Holy Land, but in the desperate cold of the north. The Siege of Ascalon was a brutal test of will. For 5 long months, the armies of Jerusalem had surrounded the city, their siege towers and battering rams making little progress against its legendary walls. Inside the Christian camp, a familiar tension simmered between the white-mantled Templars and the black-mantled Hospitallers. Both orders knew this was the last major coastal fortress held by the Fatimids, a dagger pointed at the heart of the kingdom. Failure was not an option, yet their usual competition for glory and influence threatened to paralyze the entire campaign. It was then that the young King Baldwin III made a radical decision. He summoned the masters of both orders and presented them with a simple, stark choice. They could continue their squabbling and lose everything, or they could, for the first time in their history, fight as one. This was not a suggestion, it was a royal command born of pure necessity. The pact they forged was a masterpiece of military pragmatism. The Templars, renowned for their ferocious shock assaults, would form the spearhead of the next major attack. The Hospitallers, with their unparalleled expertise in field medicine, would establish a forward aid station just behind the lines, ensuring that every wounded Templar knight received immediate care. They even coordinated their siege engines, concentrating their fire on a single, weakened section of the wall. Imagine the scene: a Templar knight, bleeding from a wound, being carried not by his own brothers, but by the men of the rival order he had distrusted for years. He would be treated by Hospitaller surgeons using skills honed in their famous hospitals. This was more than a tactical agreement, it was a profound shift in mindset. The shared objective of survival had, for a moment, eclipsed generations of rivalry. Their combined effort created a breach in the defenses, and the city fell. The capture of Ascalon was a monumental victory, securing the southern border of the Kingdom of Jerusalem for a generation. But the true legacy of Ascalon was not the captured city itself. It was the powerful, dangerous idea it planted in the minds of military commanders across Christendom. If the Templars and Hospitallers could be made to cooperate, then any rivalry could be bridged. This proof of concept would not be forgotten. Far from the desert heat, in the snow-covered wilderness of the Baltic, another king was watching and learning. He would soon attempt an even more audacious fusion of rival knightly powers, one that would create a single, terrifying military machine dedicated to conquest. The frozen marshlands of Livonia offered no comfort to the shattered Livonian brothers of the sword. Their catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Saul was more than a lost fight, it was an existential crisis. Most of their knights, including their master, lay dead on that field, and their very survival as an independent order was now in doubt. From their powerful Prussian strongholds, the Teutonic Knights watched this collapse with keen interest. They saw not a tragedy to be mourned, but an opportunity to be seized. Their offer was not one of temporary military aid, but of a complete and total merger. The surviving brothers of the sword were given a stark choice: join the Teutonic Order or face extinction. This was a corporate acquisition dressed in the armor of a rescue mission. Pope Gregory IX, eager to maintain a unified Christian front against the pagan tribes, swiftly sanctioned this absorption. With a single papal decree, the Teutonic Knights erased a rival and instantly doubled their territorial holdings. They gained control of all the Livonian Order's castles, lands, and trade routes, effectively unifying the entire Northern Crusade under one black cross. The merger created a monolithic crusader state that stretched from Prussia deep into modern-day Estonia and Latvia. This new entity, the Livonian branch of the Teutonic Order, would project power across the Baltic for centuries. Its economic and military might now concentrated and unchallenged. But this story of a powerful order saving a weaker one raises a troubling question. When does a lifeline become a chain? Our next alliance reveals a far more desperate and financially driven pact, where one order had to mortgage its very soul to survive. The muddy waters of the Nile Delta became a trap for the saintly King Louis IX of France. His grand crusade, launched with such high hopes, was now collapsing into a desperate struggle for survival. Flooded canals cut off his retreat, and the disciplined Mamluk armies closed in for the kill. In this moment of absolute peril, the ancient rivalries between the knightly orders no longer mattered. The Templars, the Hospitallers, and even the Teutonic Knights, so often at odds, found a common purpose in a single, brutal necessity: preventing the complete annihilation of the French crown. They formed a combined rearguard, a living shield of the most experienced warriors in the world. Think of the unspoken agreements made in those frantic war councils. They shared their precious maps of the labyrinthine waterways. They pooled their dwindling stocks of arrows and food. Most remarkably, they rotated command for each desperate holding action. One day, a Templar marshal would direct the defense of a narrow causeway. The next, a Hospitaller knight would take charge of a bloody retreat from a surrounded village. This was not about glory, it was about efficiency. Each order brought its unique strength to the shared nightmare: the Templars' disciplined aggression, the Hospitallers' logistical skill, and the Teutonic Knights' grim endurance. Chroniclers of the Crusade noted that without this unprecedented cooperation, the entire French force would have been slaughtered or captured. King Louis himself was saved, though he would later be taken prisoner. This temporary truce proved that survival could be a more powerful motivator than any rivalry. But this unity was as fleeting as it was fierce, born of shared desperation and dissolving the moment the immediate threat passed. It stands as a powerful example of instinctive alliance, a world away from the cold, premeditated political deal we are about to uncover. The arid plains of Las Navas de Tolosa baked under a brutal summer sun. Here in 1212, the future of Spain itself was poised on the edge of a sword. A vast Almohad army, a sea of white robes and gleaming standards, had gathered to crush the Christian kingdoms for good. For King Alfonso VIII of Castile, this was not just another battle, it was an all-or-nothing gamble for survival. He knew his own royal forces were not enough. To win, he needed to unite the most powerful and most competitive military instruments at his disposal: the knightly orders of Calatrava, Santiago, and Alcántara. These were not just rival military units, they were corporate entities locked in a constant struggle for land, influence, and the favor of different kings. Their grudges ran deep, forged over decades of border disputes and political maneuvering. Yet Alfonso managed an almost impossible feat. He convinced these proud, independent brotherhoods to set aside their regional competition and fight as one cohesive fist under the combined banners of Castile and Aragon. The king's genius lay in appealing to something greater than their rivalry: a shared religious destiny and the chance to deliver a death blow to their common enemy. On the day of the battle, the three orders did not fight as separate contingents guarding their own honor. They were integrated into the vanguard, the tip of the Christian spear. When the signal was given, their coordinated cavalry charges did not hit the Almohad lines in a piecemeal fashion. They struck as a single, thunderous wave of steel and horseflesh. The Knights of Calatrava, Santiago, and Alcántara, fighting shoulder to shoulder, shattered the enemy's center. Their disciplined, unified assault was the crucial catalyst that broke the Almohad army, turning the battle into a rout. The victory at Las Navas de Tolosa was so complete it effectively broke the back of Almohad power in Iberia, swinging the momentum of the Reconquista permanently in favor of the Christian kingdoms. It proved that a transcendent cause could temporarily dissolve even the most entrenched rivalries. But what happens when the shared goal is not salvation or survival, but something far more worldly? The next alliance reveals a pact forged not on the battlefield, but in the ledgers of bankers, where one order discovered that financial ruin could be a more dangerous enemy than any infidel army. A century after the desperate cooperation on the Nile, the old rivals perfected a new kind of warfare far from any battlefield. The year was 1365, and the Great Sea itself became their new front line. The Templars and Hospitallers, their land holdings in the Holy Land long lost, now turned their unmatched naval power against the economic heart of their enemy, Mamluk Egypt. From their island stronghold of Cyprus, they launched a coordinated blockade of the port of Alexandria, one of the wealthiest trade hubs in the known world. This was not a quest for glory, but a deliberate campaign of economic strangulation. Their combined fleets of war galleys, flying both the Red Cross and the White Cross, formed an impassable net across the sea lanes. They hunted not for enemy warships, but for fat merchant vessels heavy with spices, silks, and gold. Every cargo they seized was a direct blow to the Sultan's treasury, draining the wealth that funded his armies. This complex operation demanded a level of trust and coordination once thought impossible. The orders had to share their most sensitive intelligence on ship movements, grant each other basing rights in their respective Cypriot ports, and even agree on a strict formula for splitting the immense value of their captured prizes. For a few crucial years, the two most powerful corporations in Christendom functioned as a single, devastatingly efficient maritime syndicate. Their success proved that the knightly orders were not just relics of a bygone crusading era. They were adaptable, sophisticated entities that understood how to wield economic power as a weapon of war. This strategic pivot from the clash of swords to the silent pressure of a blockade reveals a profound evolution. It forces us to look beyond the battlefields and into the shadowy world of high finance, where the next alliance would be signed not with a sword stroke, but with the scratch of a pen on a loan agreement. A kingdom can be conquered not only by siege engines, but by the slow, silent drain of an empty treasury. This was the fate facing the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia around 1250. Wedged between the rising powers of the Mamluks to the south and the Mongols to the east, this Christian outpost was financially exhausted, its armies unpaid and its fortress walls crumbling from neglect. Its king, Hethum I, faced an impossible choice: find a massive infusion of capital or watch his realm be absorbed by its enemies. His salvation came from an unexpected source: a joint financial consortium formed by his fellow Christians, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. This was not a temporary military pact like the one at Ascalon. It was a cold, calculated business deal, brokered through the Order's sophisticated international banking networks. The Templars and Hospitallers, acting in concert for once, extended a huge loan and a revolving line of credit to the Armenian crown. Think of it as a medieval bailout package, one secured by the kingdom's most valuable assets. King Hethum had to put up his own crown lands and future tax revenues as collateral for the loan. His entire kingdom was effectively the guarantee. This massive injection of capital had an immediate and dramatic effect. The Armenian kingdom could now do what had been impossible before. It could pay its soldiers, hire mercenaries, and finance the urgent repair of its border castles. This financial lifeline, provided by the two rival orders working together, bought the Kingdom of Cilicia not just a few more years, but several more decades of fragile independence. The true significance of this alliance lies not in a battlefield, but in a ledger. It reveals the knightly orders in their most powerful and modern guise as multinational financial institutions. They were not just holy warriors, they were bankers in armor, whose coordinated economic power could literally determine the fate of nations. This financial alliance set a dangerous and influential precedent. It proved that cooperation between rivals could yield far greater profits and political influence than constant competition. This lesson in power brokering would not be lost on the noble houses of Europe, where a different kind of alliance was about to be forged, one that would blur the lines between sacred duty and secular ambition entirely. The silent power of a financial ledger could prop up a kingdom, but a subtler tool was needed to carve out a new one. While the Templars and Hospitallers were acting as bankers, the Teutonic Knights were mastering the art of political infiltration. Their target was the fractured duchies of Poland, a land bristling with independent princes and deeply suspicious of foreign influence. A direct military assault would have united every Polish lord against them. So the Teutons chose a smarter path, a diplomatic alliance with a small, local order called the Knights of Dobrin. This was not a merger like the one with the Livonian brothers. It was a partnership of convenience, a careful exchange of assets. The Knights of Dobrin were minor players, but they held something priceless: local legitimacy. They were known to the Polish princes, understood the complex web of regional loyalties, and spoke the language of the land. In return, the Teutonic Order offered everything the Dobrin Knights lacked: overwhelming military force, vast financial resources, and direct access to the Pope in Rome. Think of it as a joint venture. The Teutons provided the capital and the heavy machinery, while the Dobrin Order handled public relations and local logistics. This symbiotic relationship allowed the Teutonic Knights to present themselves not as foreign invaders, but as invited partners, Christian brothers here to help secure the frontier. They used this borrowed credibility to negotiate treaties, build fortresses, and slowly weave their own authority into the very fabric of Polish politics. This alliance proved that a handshake could be a more potent weapon than a siege engine. It was a masterclass in soft power, using a local partner to mask a long-term strategy of domination. But this clever, expansionist pact stands in stark contrast to the alliance we must examine next. A desperate and purely defensive coalition formed not to conquer, but to prevent a complete and utter collapse. A kingdom's very soul was about to be extinguished. In 1385, a colossal Castilian army swept into Portugal, its mission clear: to crush the nascent rebellion and absorb the smaller kingdom into its own. The very concept of an independent Portugal hung by a thread. In this moment of supreme crisis, the rival knightly orders within Portugal faced a choice that went beyond their usual squabbles over land and royal favor. The orders of Avis, Christ, and Santiago, each with their own loyalties and ambitions, realized that their individual power would mean nothing if their nation ceased to exist. They had to become one. The man who united them was the Grand Master of the Order of Avis, a charismatic leader named John. He did not just command one order, he forged a national army, convincing these proud brotherhoods to subordinate their ancient rivalries to a single, desperate goal: survival. Their disciplined knights, trained for generations in the border wars of the Reconquista, became the unbreakable spine of the Portuguese forces. At the Battle of Aljubarrota, this unity was put to the ultimate test. The Portuguese army, heavily outnumbered, took up a brilliant defensive position on a sloping field. Here, the coalition of orders proved its worth. They were not a chaotic mob of individual heroes, but a single, coordinated machine. Their knights fought in tight formations, supporting the infantry and using the terrain to funnel the charging Castilian cavalry into killing zones. It was a masterclass in tactical discipline, a victory born not from reckless valor but from perfect cooperation. The triumph at Aljubarrota did more than just win a battle. It secured Portuguese sovereignty for centuries to come and established the House of Avis as its ruling dynasty, with Grand Master John himself ascending to the throne as King John I. This alliance shows us knightly orders acting as the very foundation of a nation, their internal consolidation creating an unbreakable shield. But what happens when the pressure comes not from a rival kingdom, but from a force so immense it threatens the entire framework of Christendom itself? Our next story moves from national survival to a clash of civilizations, where rival orders had to stand together against a tidal wave. Even sworn crusaders could find common cause with an old enemy when a new one appeared. For the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, their very existence on the Baltic frontier was threatened by the rising power of the Lithuanian tribes. These pagan warriors were not just raiders, they were consolidating into a formidable military force that threatened to push the Christians back into the sea. In 1234, facing this overwhelming pressure, the Brothers of the Sword made a decision that would have been unthinkable in Rome. They reached out to the Orthodox Christian princes of the Novgorod Republic. On paper, these two powers were supposed to be rivals, divided by the Great Schism that had split Eastern Orthodoxy from the Catholic Church centuries before. Yet here, on the frozen ground, doctrine mattered less than survival. The pact they formed was a masterpiece of pure pragmatism. They agreed to share their most precious asset, intelligence. Novgorodian scouts who knew the dense forests and river networks intimately provided detailed reports on Lithuanian troop movements. In return, the heavily armored Knights of the Sword Brothers acted as a mobile strike force, a hammer they could direct against specific targets. This coordination along the volatile frontier created a temporary two-front pressure that checked Lithuanian expansion, if only for a short time. The alliance was always fragile, a thread stretched taut by necessity. There were no grand banquets or ceremonies of brotherhood. It was a transactional relationship built on a simple calculation that a distant, schismatic Christian was still preferable to an immediately hostile pagan power. As soon as the Lithuanian threat receded, the thread snapped. The Brothers of the Sword and the men of Novgorod returned to their usual state of wary distrust, the brief partnership fading into a forgotten footnote. Yet this episode reveals a startling truth about medieval power politics. When faced with annihilation, even the most rigid religious ideologies could bend. This kind of flexible, desperate pragmatism would soon be demanded on a scale no one could have predicted when an invasion force arrived that threatened to consume all of Europe, Christian and pagan alike. A king's authority was being torn apart by his own nobles. In the early 14th century, the throne of Hungary was not a seat of power but a prize in a brutal civil war. Powerful oligarchs, each ruling their own private fiefdoms, had risen against the young King Charles I. The rebellion reached its climax on a field near Rozgony in 1312, where the royal army faced a coalition of rebels that threatened to shatter the kingdom forever. In this moment of existential crisis, the king's most reliable allies were not his own barons but the Teutonic Knights. The order, which held substantial territories within the kingdom, made a calculated decision. They threw the full weight of their military machine behind the crown. Their contribution was not just symbolic. At the crucial moment of the battle, the order's heavily armored knights acted as a single, devastating hammer blow. They charged into the fray, a disciplined wall of steel and horseflesh that shattered the rebel lines and turned the tide of the conflict. This was not an act of charity. It was a transaction. In return for their decisive service, King Charles not only confirmed the Teutonic Order's existing land holdings, but showered them with new privileges and royal favor. The Battle of Rozgony cemented the king's power, but it also cemented the knights' position as a state within a state. This alliance reveals a cold truth about medieval power dynamics. Knightly orders were not just holy warriors on distant frontiers. They were sophisticated political operators who understood that intervening in a civil war could yield greater rewards than any crusade. They became kingmakers, their military power a currency they could spend to purchase influence and security. This calculated exchange of violence for validation would soon be mirrored in a very different corner of Europe, where another order would discover that political loyalty could be a weapon sharper than any sword. Sometimes the most powerful alliances are forged not between fellow knights, but between a knight and a merchant. The year was 1344, and the eastern Mediterranean was a shrinking Christian lake. Turkish beyliks, swift and aggressive, were gobbling up the coastline of Asia Minor, threatening the sea lanes that were the lifelines of both faith and commerce. The vital port of Smyrna was the prize, a strategic harbor held by the powerful Turkish beylik of Aydin. For the Knights Hospitaller, now based on the island of Rhodes, this was an intolerable threat. They possessed the will to fight and the soldiers to garrison a fortress, but they lacked one crucial thing: the ships to get there. their salvation came from an unexpected quarter, the great maritime republic of Genoa. The Genos were not crusaders in the traditional sense, they were businessmen. Their motivation was not the glory of God, but the security of their trade routes. The Turkish corsairs sailing from ports like Smyrna were a direct assault on their profits. A deal was struck, a perfect fusion of complementary strengths. The Genos would provide the entire transport fleet, their expert sailors, and their formidable war galleys to control the sea. The Hospitallers, in turn, would supply the invasion force, the disciplined knights and sergeants who would storm the beaches and commit to holding the city for the long term. The assault on Smyrna was a textbook example of this combined arms cooperation. Genos ships bombarded the coastal defenses, creating a safe landing zone. Then Hospitaller knights poured ashore, their heavy armor and battlefield experience overwhelming the local defenders. Once the city was secured, the Genos merchants could return to their ledgers, their part of the bargain fulfilled. The Hospitallers, however, settled in for a grueling 60-year occupation, turning Smyrna into a Christian bulwark. This pact was a masterclass in strategic outsourcing. It proved that a knightly order could achieve its military objectives by partnering with a commercial power that shared a common, if differently motivated, enemy. The Hospitallers provided the permanent fist, and the Genos provided the ship that delivered the punch. This successful model of cooperation between the cross and the coin would not go unnoticed, setting a precedent for an even more daring and politically explosive partnership on the very edge of the known world. The alliance between the Templars and the Armenian Kingdom was a bond forged over generations. When the Mamluk storm finally broke in 1266, it was not a surprise raid but a full-scale invasion aimed at erasing the Kingdom of Cilicia from the map. King Hethum II knew exactly where to turn. He activated a long-standing treaty with the Knights Templar, calling in the debt of loyalty and shared interest. The Templars, who operated powerful castles like Bagras and La Roche de Roussel along the Armenian frontier, responded without hesitation. They did not send a token force. They committed a full contingent of their best knights, a seasoned corps of professionals integrated directly into the Armenian royal army. This was not a temporary pact of convenience. It was the activation of a deep-seated alliance, the result of decades of diplomatic cultivation and mutual need. The two forces marched out together to meet the Mamluk threat at the Battle of Mari. The field became a slaughterhouse. The Armenian and Templar lines were overwhelmed by the sheer numbers and tactical brilliance of the Mamluk commander. Yet in the midst of that disastrous defeat, the value of the long-term alliance became starkly clear. The Templar Knights, with their iron discipline, did not break and run. They formed a rearguard, a moving fortress of steel that fought a controlled, bloody withdrawal. Their presence prevented a total rout, allowing King Hethum and the bulk of his army to escape the field and fall back to their mountain fortresses. While the battle was lost, the kingdom survived to fight another day precisely because the Templars honored their deep commitment. This episode reveals a crucial distinction in medieval diplomacy. Some alliances were like a sturdy bridge, built stone by stone over many years, capable of bearing immense weight even in a storm. Others were little more than a rope thrown across a chasm in a moment of pure panic. The next alliance we uncover was exactly that, a desperate, last-ditch gamble with no foundation of trust, a fleeting partnership born from the brink of total annihilation. A baptism had transformed the political landscape of Eastern Europe, but it did not erase the deep-seated ambitions of its most powerful players. The conversion of Lithuania to Christianity in 1387 removed the Teutonic Order's primary justification for its centuries-long crusade, creating a sudden and dangerous power vacuum. Into this void stepped three giant powers: the Teutonic Knights, the Kingdom of Poland, and the newly Christian Grand Duchy of Lithuania, all staring across the contested territory of Samogitia. This was the last pagan land in Europe, a rugged region of forests and marshes that Lithuania refused to surrender and the Teutonic Order desperately coveted. War seemed inevitable, a conflict that would consume them all. Then, in 1398, they achieved the impossible, a diplomatic agreement so complex it was a masterpiece of realpolitik. They established a joint administration, a condominium, over Samogitia. For the first time, these three rivals agreed to share sovereignty over the very land they had fought for generations to possess. The arrangement was a fragile artifice of power. The Teutonic Grandmaster Conrad von Jungingen saw this not as a partnership, but as a temporary legal fiction, a stepping stone that would eventually grant his order full and permanent control. He was playing the long game, using the condominium to legitimize the order's presence and slowly erode Lithuanian authority. Meanwhile, Poland and Lithuania, newly united by the marriage of their monarchs, saw the pact for what it was, a priceless gift of time. This cold peace gave them the breathing room they needed to solidify their own political union, to strengthen their armies, and to bind their nobility together. For 11 tense years, this three-way governance held, a precarious balance maintained by scribes and diplomats rather than knights. But how does a shared rule actually function when no party trusts the others? Imagine a single village in Samogitia. Its taxes might be collected by a Teutonic official one year and a Polish agent the next. Disputes between locals could be settled by a Lithuanian judge or appealed to a joint council featuring representatives from all three powers. It was a bureaucratic labyrinth, a system designed for mutual suspicion where every decision was a negotiation. This was not an alliance of friendship, but a calculated truce of pure convenience. Each signature on the treaty was a promise to delay the war, not to prevent it. The entire structure was built on a foundation of sand, and everyone knew it would not last. The shattering of this delicate arrangement would not come from a minor dispute over taxes or land rights, but from a single, audacious act of rebellion that would set the entire region ablaze. A king's baptism had erased their holy war, and now the Teutonic Knights faced a new battlefield, one of words and law. The Great Council of Constance was not a military encampment but a sprawling assembly of Europe's most powerful minds, convened to heal a schism in the papacy itself. For the Teutonic Order, it was a tribunal. Their representatives arrived not as crusading heroes but as defendants. The Polish and Lithuanian ambassadors presented a damning case, accusing the order of waging unjust wars against fellow Christians and perverting their sacred mission for mere land grabs. The very existence of the Teutonic state was now on trial. In this moment of supreme crisis, the order's leadership made a calculated diplomatic gambit. They reached out to their ancient rivals, the Knights Hospitaller and the scattered remnants of the Templars, who still operated in exile. Their argument was not based on friendship, but on cold, hard institutional survival. They framed the Polish accusations as a threat not just to the Teutons, but to the very idea of the militant order. If one order could be stripped of its lands and privileges for political reasons, they argued, then every order was vulnerable. This was an attempt to form a united lobbying front, a coalition of the cross. Imagine the hushed conversations in the corridors of power at Constance. Teutonic diplomats, their backs to the wall, meeting with Hospitaller representatives who held their own influence, and with Templar sympathizers who remembered their own order's destruction. They pooled their legal scholars and theologians, crafting intricate arguments about the divine right of military orders to govern their own territories. They presented a vision of a united Christendom defended by a brotherhood of autonomous knightly corporations, each a pillar of the Church's temporal power. For a brief moment, these rivals presented a common face to the Council, a bloc arguing that an attack on one was an attack on the sacred status of all. Yet the alliance was too little, too late. The political tide was against them. The Council of Constance ultimately condemned the Teutonic Knights, a verdict that shattered their moral authority and crippled them politically. But the true significance of this episode lies not in the failure, but in the attempt. It reveals the knightly orders thinking and acting like a modern trade association or lobbying group, using soft power, legal precedent, and theological debate to protect their collective interests. They were learning that influence in a council chamber could be as vital as a charge on an open field. This sophisticated, if unsuccessful, foray into high-stakes diplomacy set the stage for a far more visceral and explosive form of cooperation, one that would erupt on the fields of Prussia just 15 years later. For nearly a century, the formidable castle of Bagras stood as a sentinel guarding the Syrian gates, the vital mountain pass into the Principality of Antioch. Its strategic importance was absolute, a fact understood by every power in the region. But for most of the 13th century, this crucial fortress was not held by a single order. Instead, its towering walls housed a unique and often tense experiment, a permanent joint garrison of both Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller. This was not a temporary battlefield pact. This was a long-term, cohabiting command where sworn rivals had to share everything from the command tower to the granary. Imagine the daily reality of such an arrangement. Duty rosters had to be negotiated, with Templar and Hospitaller knights taking turns manning the same watchtowers. The castle's blacksmith would repair armor bearing both the Red Cross and the White Cross. Decisions on rationing supplies, repairing fortifications, and even disciplining soldiers required a council of officers from both orders, each man loyal to a different master and a different set of rules. The friction was constant, a low hum of institutional rivalry underpinning every shared meal and every coordinated patrol. Yet the system worked. The sheer practicality of the situation forced a level of cooperation no king could have commanded. Defending Bagras was simply too important a task to be jeopardized by their ancient feud. Splitting the burden meant neither order had to exhaust its own knights and resources on a single, static defense, freeing up their manpower for other campaigns. This prolonged, integrated command structure proved something profound, that even the most bitter rivals could develop a functional, if not friendly, professional relationship when faced with a common, persistent threat. The Castle of Bagras became a living laboratory for military cooperation, a microcosm of what could be achieved not in a fleeting moment of crisis, but through the grinding, day-to-day necessity of shared command. It stands as a powerful contrast to the grand, one-off alliances that defined so many battles, demonstrating that the most enduring shifts in power are sometimes built not on a single handshake, but on the slow, stubborn work of 1,000 shared duties. This grinding daily reality of shared command reveals a different kind of strength, one born not of passion but of pure, unyielding pragmatism. The sea itself became the battlefield off the coast of Rhodes. A massive Mamluk fleet, its sails darkening the horizon, descended upon the island in 1444. For the Knights Hospitaller, this was not just an attack, it was an assault on their very home, the headquarters they had built over a century. They knew their own galleys were not enough to break the coming storm, but they did not stand alone. A swift messenger ship had already raced to the lagoon city of Venice, calling in a debt of shared necessity. The Venetian Republic, always pragmatic, understood the calculation instantly. If Rhodes fell, the eastern Mediterranean would become a Mamluk lake, and their precious trade routes to the Levant would be severed. Profit and piety aligned in a single, urgent purpose. They dispatched a squadron of their finest war galleys, sleek and deadly vessels crewed by the most experienced sailors in the world. The resulting defense was a masterclass in coordinated naval warfare. The Hospitallers brought their intimate knowledge of the local waters and their fanatical determination to defend their home. The Venetians contributed their unmatched skill in ship handling and fleet tactics. Together, their combined fleet did not meet the Mamluks in a single, grand confrontation. They waged a war of attrition, a series of sharp, brutal engagements where they harried the invasion force, cut off its supply lines, and picked apart its formations. They used the channels and hidden coves around Rhodes as a weapon, luring enemy ships into traps where they could be destroyed piece by piece. The Mamluks, expecting to crush a single isolated order, found themselves fighting a hybrid force, a fusion of monastic resolve and mercantile maritime genius. They were repelled completely, their invasion collapsing into a costly retreat. This victory was not celebrated with a grand crusading hymn, but with the quiet scratching of pens on trade agreements. The alliance proved that the survival of a knightly order could be directly tied to the commercial fortunes of a maritime power. It was a symbiosis where the cross and the lion of St. Mark protected each other, because one provided the shield and the other guaranteed the flow of gold. This reliance on a partner's unique strength makes you wonder what happens when the challenge is not a fleet of ships, but the very walls of a city, demanding a shared solution born not of commerce, but of engineering and sheer desperation. A castle does not rise from the desert rock through faith or fury alone. It is born from a mountain of quarried stone, a forest of timber, and the coordinated labor of hundreds of skilled hands. Along the sun-blasted frontier of 13th century Iberia, the rival orders of Calatrava and Santiago mastered this patient art of collaborative creation. Their shared enemy was not just the Moorish armies to the south, but the creeping vulnerability of an undefended border. To counter it, they forged an alliance not of battle cries, but of blueprints and mortar. They pooled their most valuable non-military assets, their master stonemasons, their siege engineers, and their finite reserves of gold, to undertake monumental projects like the great fortress of Calatrava La Nuva. This was not a temporary pact for a single campaign. It was a decades-long commitment to a shared defensive architecture. Imagine the scene at such a construction site. A master architect sponsored by the Order of Calatrava might direct the layout of the towering keep, while a siege engineer from Santiago oversaw the design of the arrow slits and murder holes. Their workers would labor side by side, hauling the same stones to build walls that would protect both orders equally. This logistical partnership meant the frontier could be fortified twice as fast and at half the cost to either order alone. The result was a consolidated defensive line, a chain of impregnable strongholds that presented a unified Christian front. This patient, brick-by-brick alliance transformed the border from a chaotic patchwork of rival fiefs into a hardened shield, steadily pushing the Reconquista southward through the sheer weight of stone and shared purpose. It proves that the most enduring shifts in power are sometimes engineered in peace, long before the first arrow is ever loosed. This slow, deliberate form of alliance making stands in stark contrast to the frantic and often secretive pacts that were about to unfold in the shadowy corridors of papal power. A shared victory can be the prelude to a bitter divorce. In the early 13th century, the pagan lands of Estonia were the prize, and two Christian powers decided they were stronger together than apart. The Teutonic Knights, pushing ever northward from their Prussian strongholds, found their advance checked by the fierce resistance of the Estonian tribes. They possessed the heavy cavalry and disciplined infantry for a land war, but lacked the ships to control the coastline and open a decisive new front. Their solution was a pact with King Valdemar II of Denmark, a monarch with a powerful navy and his own designs on the Baltic. The agreement was a perfect, if cynical, marriage of complementary strengths. The Danish fleet would deliver the knights to the Estonian shore, establishing a fortified beachhead from which the Teutonic war machine could operate. Think of the Danes as the architects of the door, and the Teutons as the battering ram that would charge through it. The alliance worked with brutal efficiency. Danish ships landed Teutonic Knights on the coast, and together they overwhelmed the local defenders, leading to the rapid conquest of northern Estonia. For a few short years, the red and white Danish banner and the black cross of the Teutonic Order flew side by side over captured fortresses, but this was never a partnership of trust. It was a transaction between two rival corporations who never stopped eyeing the same assets. The very lands they conquered together became the source of their undoing. Each victory only heightened the tension over who would ultimately control the spoils. The alliance, so effective in war, contained the seeds of its own destruction in peace. It collapsed into open conflict, with former allies fighting over the territories they had just seized. This episode lays bare a brutal truth of medieval geopolitics. An alliance of convenience between two expansionist powers is like a rope made of fire. It can pull you to the top of the wall, but it will inevitably burn through and send you crashing down. The shared goal of conquest was simply not enough to overcome their competing dreams of empire. This inherent friction between partners with identical ambitions creates a pattern we will see again, not on the cold Baltic coast, but in the very heart of the Mediterranean world. The walls of Acre were collapsing into dust and fire. In the final, suffocating hours of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land, all the old rules of chivalry and rivalry evaporated. The last Christian stronghold was being systematically dismantled by the Mamluk war machine, and the priority was no longer victory but survival. Amidst the chaos, the Knights Templar made a cold, calculated decision. They approached King Henry II of Cyprus with a desperate proposal. The order still possessed two things of immense value: a vast treasury of gold and silver, and a fleet of ships waiting in the harbor. They offered these assets to the king in exchange for a single, priceless commodity, a future. The deal was struck in the shadow of falling towers. The Templars would use their ships and their wealth to finance a mass evacuation, saving not only their own brothers but as many civilians and stranded soldiers as possible. In return, King Henry guaranteed them a secure and privileged base on his island kingdom of Cyprus. This was not a retreat, it was a strategic transfer of an entire institution. The Templar fleet became a floating ark, carrying the last remnants of the Crusader dream away from the doomed shore. Their treasure, once meant to fund the reconquest of Jerusalem, now bought them a new home and a promise of political influence. This alliance transformed a total military catastrophe into a managed rebirth. While the Templars lost their purpose in the Holy Land, they saved their very existence. Cyprus became the new heart of the order, a launchpad for their future ambitions and a testament to their ability to survive not by the sword, but by the shrewd use of financial and naval power. This desperate pact reveals a profound truth, that the most successful alliances are sometimes those made not for conquest, but for salvation, ensuring that an idea can live on long after its fortress has fallen. A fortress cannot survive on faith and swords alone. It needs a constant pulse of goods and gold to keep its heart beating. After the Knights Hospitaller established their new headquarters on the island of Rhodes, they faced this fundamental challenge. How could an isolated island state fund its massive defensive works, maintain its powerful navy, and support its population of knights, sergeants, and support staff? The answer arrived not with a fleet of warships, but with the merchant galleys of Genoa. In 1374, these two powers signed a trade agreement that was a masterpiece of economic foresight. The Hospitallers granted Genoese merchants highly favorable tariffs, making it cheaper for them to sell their goods in Rhodian ports than anywhere else in the region. In return, the order received a guaranteed and predictable income from customs duties, a financial lifeblood that flowed directly into their treasury with every ship that docked. Rhodes was suddenly flooded with silks from the east, spices from the Indies, and fine glassware from Italy. The island transformed from a purely military bastion into a bustling commercial crossroads, a vibrant hub where the languages of trade and war were spoken in the same markets. This was not a fleeting military pact born of desperation. It was a sophisticated, long-term partnership built on a foundation of mutual economic benefit. The Genoese got rich, and the Hospitallers got the stable financial platform they needed to become the undisputed naval power of the Eastern Mediterranean. Their fates became so intertwined that a bad trading season in Genoa could directly impact the number of new galleys the order could build. This deep interdependence, this fusion of commercial and military power, created a new model for survival. It proved that the most resilient alliances are those where both parties profit not just from victory, but from the simple, daily act of doing business. This intricate web of trade and supply would soon reveal an even deeper consequence, one that moved beyond economics and into the very soul of a society, where the exchange of goods began to pave the way for a more profound exchange of ideas. Their bitter rivalry on the battlefield masked a quiet, continuous exchange in the shadows. While the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights competed fiercely for land and influence, they all understood that certain information was too vital to hoard. In the back rooms of Acre and Jerusalem, a de facto intelligence alliance operated day and night. It was a collaboration born of pure necessity, a shared recognition that survival in the Holy Land depended not just on strong swords, but on deep understanding. They maintained shared networks of translators, men fluent in Arabic and Turkish who could interpret everything from a merchant's gossip to an intercepted military dispatch. These linguists were among the most valuable and least celebrated assets of the entire Crusader project. The orders also pooled their cartographic knowledge. A Templar map detailing a hidden mountain pass in the Lebanese ranges might be combined with a Hospitaller chart of coastal currents, creating a complete picture for a joint campaign. They even shared detailed dossiers on the personalities and political divisions within the Muslim world. A Templar agent in Damascus might learn that a certain Mamluk emir was feuding with the Sultan in Cairo, information he would pass to a Hospitaller contact, who could then use it to time a raid or propose a temporary truce with the disgruntled emir. This was not about friendship, but about creating a shared operating system for survival. This flow of cultural and military intelligence allowed the Crusader states to punch far above their weight, anticipating invasions, playing rival Muslim factions against each other, and navigating the complex diplomatic landscape. How do you think this secret sharing worked in practice? Imagine a Hospitaller knight, fresh from a patrol, dictating his observations of a new Mamluk cavalry formation to a scribe. That report would not simply gather dust in a Hospitaller archive. It would be copied and sent to the local Templar commandery, and even to the house of the Teutonic Knights. This informal web of knowledge turned every knight, regardless of his order, into a censor for the entire Christian presence. This subtle, unspoken pact to share the secrets of their enemy was perhaps the most pragmatic alliance of all. It required no treaties and no oaths, only the cold, logical understanding that in a land surrounded by adversaries, knowledge was the one currency that could not be spent selfishly. This brilliant background cooperation stands in stark contrast to the final alliance we must uncover, a pact forged not in the shadows, but in the blinding light of total, undeniable defeat. A final, desperate stand would define the legacy of the knightly order forever. By 1565, the Knights Hospitaller had transformed from a land-based brotherhood into the masters of a floating fortress, the island of Malta. Their enemy was the most powerful empire on earth, the Ottoman Turks, who dispatched an armada of nearly 200 ships and tens of thousands of elite troops to wipe this Christian thorn from their side. This was not a medieval skirmish, but a clash of civilizations, and the Hospitallers knew they could not face it alone. Grand Master Jean de Valette activated every diplomatic and military connection he possessed, forging a coalition that was unprecedented in its scope. He united Spanish tercios from Sicily, Italian mercenaries, and the entire native population of Malta into a single, defiant force. This was no longer just the Order of St. John. It was a multinational, multi-ethnic alliance with the Hospitallers as its unbreakable core. Their leadership provided the strategic genius that coordinated every aspect of the defense. Spanish infantry, renowned for their discipline, held the breach at Fort St. Elmo under a hail of cannon fire. Maltese civilians, armed with whatever they could find, fought in the streets of their towns. Italian engineers directed the repair of shattered walls under cover of darkness. The order itself was the glue, its knights fighting and dying in the most exposed positions, their iconic red surcoats becoming a symbol of unwavering resolve. For 3 brutal months, this coalition endured endless assaults, famine, and disease. The victory, when it came, was not just a military triumph, it was a testament to the ultimate evolution of the knightly alliance. It proved that a single order could transcend its own history to become the commander of a vast international army, a far cry from the secret pacts and temporary truces that began our story. From the shared command of a single castle to the leadership of a grand coalition that saved a continent, the journey of these warrior monks reveals a timeless truth about power, that even the fiercest rivals must sometimes become partners to face a storm too great for any one of them to withstand alone. A king and a pope could dissolve an order, but they could not erase the bonds between its sworn brothers. The official suppression of the Knights Templar in 1312 was meant to be a final act, a complete and total erasure of their power. Yet the moment the papal decree was issued, a more subtle and resilient alliance began to form in the shadows. It was not an alliance of banners or treaties, but one of shared memory and dispersed influence. Across Spain and Portugal, where the Templars had been deeply entrenched in the Reconquista, their surviving members and vast estates were formally transferred to the Knights Hospitaller and local orders like the Order of Christ. On paper, this was a simple administrative transfer of assets. In reality, it was an infiltration of one culture into another. Former Templar Knights, now wearing the white cross of the Hospitallers or the new emblem of the Order of Christ, brought with them more than just their swords. They carried generations of accumulated tactical knowledge, from their unique understanding of finance to their distinct methods of fortification and naval warfare. An informal network of these men persisted, a brotherhood within a brotherhood. They maintained their old connections through letters, shared patrons, and the quiet conversations in commanderies that had once been Templar strongholds. This alliance of legacy meant that Templar expertise did not vanish. It simply went underground, subtly shaping the policies and priorities of their new hosts. The Portuguese Order of Christ, inheriting the Templars' vast maritime assets and their most experienced sea captains, became the direct inheritor of this hidden tradition. The sails of the caravels that would soon brave the open Atlantic, bearing explorers like Vasco da Gama, were not emblazoned with the Templar cross, but with the cross of the Order of Christ, a symbol that was, in spirit and personnel, its direct descendant. The navigational science, the financial backing, and the crusading zeal that propelled the age of exploration were all deeply infused with the preserved knowledge of the dissolved order. This final, posthumous alliance demonstrates a profound truth about institutional power. You can disband a corporation, but you cannot disband the shared identity of its people. The most enduring alliances are not always between organizations, but between the individuals who carry its purpose forward, ensuring that even in dissolution, a legacy can reshape the world. Their unique vow of service gave them a power no other order could claim. The Knights of St. Lazarus, dedicated to the care of those afflicted with leprosy, existed on the outer edges of the chivalric world. While other orders competed for castles and glory, the Lazarites managed their hospices, their identity forged in a ministry of compassion that set them apart. Yet this very separation became their greatest strategic asset. When a bitter land dispute erupted between the Templars and Hospitallers over a fertile valley, or when the Teutonic Knights and the Order of Calatrava clashed over the ransom for a captured commander, direct negotiation was often impossible. The pride of these great institutions would not allow it. In these moments of stalemate, they turned to the one brotherhood everyone trusted, the Knights of St. Lazarus. Their perceived moral purity, born from their selfless work with society's outcasts, made them the only acceptable neutral party. A Lazarite knight, identifiable by his distinctive green cross, could ride into the camps of both sides without being seen as a spy or an agent of the other. He carried no sword of conquest but the authority of a higher calling. Imagine such a mediator shuttling between two fortified commanderies, carrying sealed offers and counteroffers. He was a living channel of communication, facilitating truces that allowed harvests to be gathered and negotiating the delicate exchange of high-value prisoners. His presence did not guarantee agreement, but it guaranteed that dialogue, the lifeblood of any fragile peace, could continue. This was an alliance not of military might, but of perceived impartiality. The Lazarites provided a service that was as critical as any cavalry charge, the restoration of basic diplomacy. They were the lubricant in the grinding gears of inter-order politics, preventing the constant friction from sparking into all-out war. Their role reminds us that in a world defined by armored conflict, the most binding force could sometimes be a voice that asked for nothing but peace. These secret pacts, scattered across centuries and battlefields, weave together into a single, startling revelation. The driving force behind nearly every alliance was not faith or chivalry, but pure, unadulterated pragmatism. Time and again, when faced with an existential threat or a golden opportunity, these holy warriors set aside their sacred banners and deep-seated grudges. The shared need to survive a Mamluk army, the mutual desire to profit from a block trade route, the cold calculation required to absorb a rival, all of these were decisions grounded in the harsh reality of the moment. Ideology was a luxury they could not afford when the walls were crumbling or the treasury was empty. This consistent pattern of practical cooperation reveals a medieval world far more complex and calculating than the simple tales of crusader versus infidel. It was a chessboard where the players would quietly, and without fanfare, change sides if it meant saving their most important pieces. The primary catalyst for these unlikely partnerships was almost always a shared and overwhelming threat, one that could not be faced alone. For the Portuguese orders at El Jubarota, it was the specter of national annihilation. For the rival orders in the Holy Land, it was the simple, brutal math of being outnumbered on a foreign shore. A common enemy, whether a human army or the slow drain of financial ruin, proved to be the most powerful unifier. This dynamic created a fluid and ever-shifting balance of power. A knightly order could be a bitter rival in one decade and a crucial ally in the next. The Teutonic Knights learned this in their dealings with Poland and Lithuania, where the condominium over Samogitia was less a partnership and more a temporary freezing of a conflict, a strategic pause that allowed all sides to regroup and rearm for the next round of fighting. These pacts did not just manage conflicts, they actively reshaped the political map of an era. The merger that created the Livonian branch of the Teutonic Order redrew the borders of the Baltic world. The financial bailout of the Armenian Kingdom by the Templars and Hospitallers prolonged the life of a Christian state for generations. The coalition that saved Malta did not just win a siege, it halted the westward expansion of the Ottoman Empire and secured the central Mediterranean for Christian powers. The legacy of these knightly negotiations echoes far beyond the medieval period. The very concept of a balance of power, where states formed temporary alliances to prevent any single power from dominating, was being practiced in microcosm by these military brotherhoods centuries before it became a formal doctrine of European statecraft. Their sophisticated use of joint financial ventures, shared intelligence networks, and complex treaty agreements laid the groundwork for the international diplomacy that would follow. These warrior monks were not just fighting for their faith, they were pioneering the intricate dance of geopolitics, proving that sometimes the most decisive victory is not won with a sword, but with a carefully offered hand. These 24 secret pacts reveal a medieval world far more intricate than the simple tales of holy war. The true weapon was not always the sword, but the handshake offered to a sworn enemy in a moment of shared need. From the desperate cooperation at Ascalon to the sophisticated legal defense at the Council of Constance, these alliances consistently demonstrate that pragmatism, not piety, was the most powerful force driving these warrior monks. Their shared goals of survival, profit, or political advantage proved strong enough to temporarily dissolve generations of bitter rivalry. This hidden history forces us to reconsider the very nature of medieval power. The knight was not just a warrior of faith, but a sophisticated operator in a complex geopolitical landscape, where a well-negotiated treaty could secure more territory than a dozen cavalry charges. The interplay between their sacred oaths and their worldly ambitions created a constant tension, one that was only resolved when necessity demanded an alliance. So the next time you picture a knight in shining armor, remember that the treaty in his hand might have been as important as the sword at his side. If this journey through the shadowy diplomacy of the medieval world has intrigued you, subscribe for more deep dives into forgotten histories, and let us know in the comments which of these surprising alliances you found most compelling.